Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 21st of November 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Girish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, where do we start?
Well, another day, another defence pact. Brian, this extends the Lancaster House treaties between the UK and France. But apparently we need to increase security cooperation in the Channel, Brian.
I'm utterly fascinated by this, Mike, because if you say to me, what has become special about the Channel that requires us to form some special extra bit of defence pact with the French, I don't know. And I can't find out because, of course, this wasn't debated in Westminster at all.
Absolutely. So this is Gavin Williamson's first bilateral meeting between the UK and his French counterpart. For the Armed Forces Florence Parley, apparently. Did you get that? The Armed Forces Florence Parley. But anyway,
not Florence of Arabia.
No, I don't think so. No. Well, they were reaffirming the strength of British-French defence ties at Admiralty House yesterday, this followed an inspection of a Guard of Honour at Horse Guards Parade. So that was pretty exciting for her. And Gavin Williamson had this to say. He said, "As we leave the European Union, we will continue our relationship with our European allies, and a vital part of this will be through our defence relationship. The Channel is of huge importance to both our countries, and this new agreement demonstrates our commitment to work with international partners to help tackle the threat of piracy and terrorism around the globe." Because the English Channel is a hot spot for piracy, for global piracy. Yeah.
I don't know what to say on this subject, Mike. I don't know what to say anymore because this is becoming so bizarre. What is actually going on here? We don't know because nothing's been debated. We had the original 50-year defence pact with the French, came out of David Cameron's mouth, and then it happened. There was no debate on that. So what is so special about the Channel?
Well, there's something, we need to look at this in more detail. This agreement and this meeting is in the run-up to the UK-France summit, which comes just after Christmas, and we'll see what happens there. But we're going to look at this particular issue in more detail. But in the meantime, if this is what they're doing with the French, what are we actually doing with our military, Brian? And here's the answer. We're turning them into park rangers. Now, many people would say that this is a useful thing to do in the sense, and perhaps I agree, because I don't particularly support the so-called illegal trade in wildlife. It's estimated to be between 7 and 17 billion pounds a year. And so the British Army is partnering with the Malawian Department for National Parks and Wildlife in order to try to deal with this problem. Well, I think the point here, is that while this is a reprehensible trade and shouldn't be taking place, should we be deploying troops in this area when it's a fraction of the scale of the damage that's being done, for example, by this in Afghanistan, as we highlighted a couple of days ago? What did we have? 36,000 hectares of poppy production and 700 hectares dealt with by eradicated.
Yeah.
So when are we going to deploy our assets in the right places to deal with the right types of problems?
Well, there's an irony here, Mike, isn't there? Because of course we have deployed military assets in Afghanistan, but we've watched poppy production increase. We haven't got enough troops to deploy in other areas. We've got a major crisis in troop numbers, especially for the army. But we're now going to make them park rangers. And if I remember that figure that you've just given correctly, between 7 and 17 billion was the estimate. So that's a pretty wide margin. We clearly don't know much about the trade at all, because the best estimate we can give is between 7 and 17 billion.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Fantastic.
Well, let's bring in the next part of the decline of UK. This is orchestrated decline, of course. Was this wonderful headline by the Mail. Now, I'm going to say credit where it's due, because this journalist is looking in the right area but still doesn't get it. So what's the headline? MI5 and police's inquiry into themselves finds they made no mistakes over 4 terror strikes in UK this year, even though terrorists involved were all on their radar. So the accusation is we've got the security services saying we're doing a great job, we're consuming billions of pounds, but we're doing a great job protecting the nation. But the attacks are still coming through, and then we discover after the attacks have taken place that the people have been known to the British security services for some time. So they are tasked with investigating themselves, and surprise, surprise, they find that they haven't done anything wrong. The Mail says, well, this is a bit like you marking your own homework. So this is some of the comments here. The conclusion comes despite a series of revelations about past fears over those who carried out the attacks in Westminster, Manchester, London Bridge and Finsbury Park. So it's not just once they made a mistake, it's been repeated time and again. Concerns have been raised that the reviews were carried out internally, and Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee is now looking at whether to launch its own inquiry. And if we bring in the last one, which is really the key one, Labour MP Paul Flynn pointed out that the committee had only just been nominated and no democratically accountable body had been able to scrutinise the handling of the attacks. No democratically accountable body. So we have got a mercenary organisation now in here. Let's just bring in the meat of it, because to me this is key. We've got democratically unaccountable security services, but it's these same people that are now flagging up our children for life under their prevent anti-terrorism measures.
Yes.
Now, we've been told this, we know this, because some Metropolitan Police deeply concerned to discover that basically when the teams are going into schools and flagging up children as potential terrorists, that record is a security services record, it's not a police record, and yet we now see that the whole of this security system is, quote, democratically unaccountable. So well done to MP Flynn for pointing this out. Not so well done to the Daily Mail journalists for simply leaving the story hanging there without starting to bring people to account like Amber Rudd and Theresa May. And I'm just going to also remind people that, of course, it was the Conservative Party around Francis Maude, he was the central figure, that has linked British security services in extremely closely with Israeli organisations. And this includes, you can just see it top left on your screen, the Israeli Defence Force Unit 8200, 8200, but also Israeli universities that are fringe element for their own security services. All of this linkage put together around Francis Maude and the Conservative Cabinet Office without any single debate inside Westminster. So the unaccountable British security services now include those unaccountable links with Israeli security services.
Well, speaking of Israel, we haven't noticed this in the press too much, certainly not in the mainstream press over here, Brian, but Benjamin Netanyahu has now been questioned for the 6th time on corruption charges by the police in Israel, this time on the 19th of November. The investigation began 8 months ago, and they're looking at what's being described as Case 1000, which is the gifts affair. So the question is whether Netanyahu had received gifts from Israeli businessmen. And he's also being investigated under what's being described as Case 2000, which involves influence directed towards the publisher of the Yedioth Ahronoth publication, which is the country's largest newspaper. So Mr. Netanyahu seems to be experiencing a bit of a problem and under investigation. I'm fascinated that the anti-corruption investigations going on in Saudi and Israel at the same time. I wonder, is that indicative of something?
I don't know. It's a shame we haven't got one going on here at the same time, Mike.
Well,
perhaps that's coming.
Well, perhaps it is. Now, something interesting happened in Parliament yesterday. Can you believe that?
Well, it certainly wasn't to do with defence and the Channel, so it must have been something exceptional.
Well, let's have a look.
Lisa Nandy. this House, the Home Secretary told me that some papers would be withheld from the Cyril Smith inquiry for national security reasons. This week, the Prime Minister has written to me to say we are clear that the work of the security services will not prevent information being shared with other such inquiries. So can she confirm for the survivors of Cyril Smith, who have waited for justice for decades, that she was wrong and that the Prime Minister is right?
Well, I'm happy to confirm the Prime Minister is always right, and I will certainly look carefully at the letter that the Honourable Lady has received to ensure that we comply with it.
Now, I'm sure Amber Rudd was speaking purely tongue-in-cheek there. I'm sure she wasn't really serious about that.
Well, I would suspect she is, Mike, because as you pointed out yesterday, it's clear that Conservative central office is telling backbenchers what to say in matters of defence. So I think we've now got a political system where the leaders are always right, their views are the correct views, and if you don't follow those views, you're going to be leaving the party pretty quickly.
So anyway, the question is, why would an investigation or papers related to an investigation involving child sexual abuse carried out by a Member of Parliament, why would that fall under the remit of the security service, or national security rather?
Well, inherently it'd be under national security, because national security there is to see what the blackmail risk is of principally politicians and military people, which is why the so-called personal vetting, the background checks take place. You want to know about the background so that if you have somebody who's involved in crime or taking drugs or involved in prostitution, whatever it is, they could be a risk to blackmail from a foreign power. So,
okay, but that's fair enough for a currently serving MP or a currently serving member of the government. But of course, what we're talking about here is Cyril Smith, who hasn't been a sitting MP for quite a number of years and is in fact deceased. So in this case, you've got to wonder why Theresa May, well, she has apparently overruled this situation, but why the Home Office would feel that any papers relating to a deceased MP would fall under the remit of national security when it's historical?
Well, in my opinion, because that historical path would bring us up to the present day, and it would show that not only the covering up of child abuse, but the act of child abuse itself is not historical. It's an ongoing theme in the British government. So that would be my suggestion as to what the fear is.
Now, of course, MI5 does know some things, and that came out in the child abuse inquiry a couple of days ago, or a week or two ago, whenever there was some, they were looking into the situation in Rochdale, which is, of course, where Cyril Smith was MP. And what came out of that was that the Department for Public Prosecutions, as it was then, had told MI5 that they were aware of allegations against Cyril Smith, but these were spurious allegations in the media. They weren't really we didn't need to worry about them too much. Unfortunately, the Department for Public Prosecutions the Director for Public Prosecutions at the time had tried to cover this up. So it's the inquiry has discovered this communication between the DPP and MI5. So maybe there's going to be more coming out from the inquiry on this involvement or this awareness of the security services. You've got to ask the question, if they were aware of allegations, why they didn't investigate further. In the public interest, Mike, we have to say in the public interest, because it's not in the public interest to know that you have paedophiles who are not only MPs, but they're part of serving governments. Yep. Okay, censorship then. At the weekend, Eric Schmidt, who is executive chairman of Google's parent company Alphabet, was speaking at the Halifax Forum, Security Forum, and he was saying that Google is going to engineer algorithms to make sure that RT and Sputnik are deranked, as he called it. In other words, moved down the search rankings. He said, we're working on detecting and deranking those kinds of sites. It's basically RT and Sputnik, which he described as Russian propaganda. He said that they're trying to engineer systems to prevent content from being delivered to a broad audience. But we don't want to ban the sites, he said. That's not how we operate. So that's okay then. We're not going as if he had the power to ban sites in any case, but I presume he means from Google. And he said that he was very strongly not in favour of censorship, but he does have faith in Google's ranking algorithms.
Right.
Right. He said that the ranking algorithms would be capable of detecting repetitive, exploitative, false and weaponized information. And he said that we started with the default American view that bad speech would be replaced with good speech. But the problem, yes,
right.
But the problem found in the last year is that this may not be true in certain situations. Especially when you have a well-funded opponent who's trying to actively spread disinformation. So there you go. I don't really know what to say about that, but
it's censorship.
Well, it goes beyond that really, and something needs to be done about this. What has become a global monopoly on search. On the internet, and he can say all he likes that he's not censoring anybody, but when such a large proportion of the planet is using his company to find information on the internet, that's a pretty dangerous position to be taking.
It is. Well, let's stay on censorship and come in a different direction, and credit here to Pride's Purge. This is the header. BBC use independent organisation funded by Daily Mail and UK government as fact checkers. Now, I really couldn't resist this particular article, and this is part of the meat of it. It says, recently the British Medical Journal published a report compiled by researchers from various universities, including Oxford, Cambridge and University College London, which suggested as many as 120,000 people have died as a result of Tory austerity since 2010. And they've got an insert here of the BMJ open article, Health and Social Care Spending Cuts linked to 120,000 excess deaths. Now, what did the BBC have to say about this? Well, it said this. Our audiences expect the BBC to provide impartial and well-sourced news they can trust. You happy so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. We carefully considered whether the BMJ Open study merited reporting, including verifying it with other sources, and on this occasion we concluded it did not. The Science Media Centre, an independent body that peer reviews scientific news, has raised concerns that the conclusions were highly speculative and should be treated with caution. So we've got lots of upstanding BBC self-righteousness there. So obviously the place to go to is the Science Media Centre. So let's bring this up on screen. And we've got some fascinating individuals here. The first one we've got is Jonathan Baker, the chair, Professor of Journalism, University of Exeter, brackets, ex-head of news gathering BBC. So I'm sure he's completely impartial. We better just bring in another one down at the bottom. We've got Fran Unsworth, Director of World Services Group BBC. So the organisation the BBC quotes as independent is actually partly their organisation.
Well, it's certainly got ex-staff, and of course, but ex-staff will immediately cut all ties with previous staff and they'll never speak to them again, right?
Yeah, but Fran Unsworth is actually Director of the World Services Group BBC.
Oh.
So they are involved up to their knees. I better stop at the knees, of course. And
as long as you don't touch them on the way.
As long as we don't touch them. Well, then it gets more interesting because we can have a look at grants. So what sort of independent organisations will be commenting? Well, we've got Biotechnology and Biological Science Research Council, GlaxoSmithKline and the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. Then it goes on for grants over £30,000. Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So the government's involved here.
Right.
And it's got the Wellcome Trust. And then if we drop down that list a little bit, I'll have to pull it up. The text is a bit small. Previous funders have also included BBC Worldwide.
And that's the commercial arm of the BBC, is that right?
Indeed it is.
Yes.
So the BBC is actually censoring news in a fake way by calling upon organisations it says is independent, but in fact they're part of the BBC, connected to the BBC. Mm-hmm. So This, I would suggest, is probably more devious than Mr. Schmidt saying publicly what he's going to do. This is the BBC censoring in a dirty, underhand way. Well done, BBC. Well, let's just bring in an ad that we showed last week. Lady in Plymouth is facing the danger of eviction for a second time. This is following years of fraudulent activity in the courts and around documents that have been produced in order to evict her. Her address is on screen, her email address is on screen, and if you're in the southwest or feel motivated enough about this eviction to travel to give this lady some support, so we believe the eviction will take place on this Thursday, the 23rd of November, 2 o'clock possibly, but of course they've been known to turn up early. We think that this lady deserves support because of the amount of support that she and her late partner gave to the UK column. So if you can be around to support, we would be very grateful. And of course, as we always say, it is polite, it is reasonable, it is being there to show support to this lady. Anybody suggesting any form of physical activity, of course, not welcome.
Well, we've got some good news, Brian, because Swansea has decided that it wants to be Wales's first designated human rights city. So this is good news, isn't it? And a human rights city commits itself to helping disadvantaged citizens. It would mean, according to this document that they've created for themselves, it would mean businesses and organisations would have to apply the principle of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in everyday activities. And they say that if the city goes for the title, it would join 100 cities worldwide, including Washington, D.C. in the US and Vienna in Austria. York is the first UK city to hold the status. Well, here we go. They're going to do that. And I'm sure that means that all the homeless people in Swansea are going to be well looked after from now on. They're not going to be scraped off the streets and moved elsewhere so that people can't see them. They're going to be helped. Yes?
Right. Yes, okay,
yeah.
keep going.
So I'm sorry, I'm just being a little bit sarcastic about this because I find the whole thing rather cynical. I don't see any evidence of any city in Britain actually treating what are described as disadvantaged citizens
in a more kindly way.
In a kindly
well,
way.
Well, they're not, and many cities have closed down homeless capacity, so night refuges have been closed down, and people trying to help people who are sleeping on the rough on the streets, people trying to help at night with soup kitchens have also been closed down by city authorities. So I totally agree with that. I think we're right in saying that a lot of the city-state agenda is coming straight out of the United Nations. And I just wanted to come back onto your excellent section yesterday on the news. I watched the UK column News from Home. And when I saw this, I was just horrified. And I'm so pleased that you picked it up with Patrick Henningsen. What is this to do with kids takeover? But you pointed out, of course, the hanging tongues and the fact that the boys and girls in the background seem to all be wearing some form of dress, which suggests the movement towards the normalisation, i.e. the removal of heterosexual identity into we're all one blob. But it was the tongues that really caught my eye. And I'd encourage people to go and have a look on an appropriate search engine for pop stars videos and the sticking out of tongues. And I have to warn you that some of these videos, which are pop videos, they're meant for quite young children, pretty offensive in what they show, but the sticking out tongue is there very clearly. And I'll leave people to go and research that for themselves, but I'm going to say it leads us to a very dark place indeed. Now, this was part of the main text of the Kids Takeover, the Universal Children's Day on the 20th of November. I had a look through what sort of people were taking part. David Beckham was one of them. Of course, you need him to advise the world's children on how to really conduct themselves. But the other people there included actors from this film, Transformers. the last night. And as the little inset says, Autobots and Decepticons are at war with humans on the sideline. So this is a very dark agenda, but these are the people that have been selected to work with the world's children. Of course, what they don't boast is about the relationship with the Lucis Trust. And I think many people will be very interested in this. I encourage them to go and research it themselves. But here is the Lucis Trust. And if we look at top right there, we can see some very interesting things. It's talking about the Arcane School, triangles. World Goodwill is coming out of the Lucis Trust, Mike. And we've got the Great Invocation, Global Network, Resources, and matters to do with the full moon. Now, why should we be interested in this organisation? Well, because it's inherently supporting the UN. The Lucis Trust has consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, and World Goodwill is recognised by the Department of Public Information at the UN as a non-governmental organisation. So this isn't some sideline organisation. This is at the forefront of UN policy, and they're happy to boast about it. Why do we need to know? Well, let's have a little look at their history, and it starts to become clear. So the Lucis Trust was established by Alison Foster Bailey as a vehicle to foster recognition of the universal spiritual principles at the heart of all work to build right relations. It goes on to talk about being incorporated in the state of New Jersey, USA. It shows links into Geneva. This is the organisation which boasts of using the work of Theosophical founder Blavatsky. And it goes on to say this, which I find really fascinating. So, sorry, we've got an admission that a publishing company initially named the Lucifer Publishing Company was established by the Baileys, but people got a bit wise to that, so it was changed eventually to the Lucis Trust. But have a look down here. It says, it soon became clear to the Baileys that some Christian groups have traditionally mistakenly identified Lucifer with Satan. And for this reason, the company's name was changed in 1924 to Lucis Publishing Company. So a bit of confusion there as to what this lot were doing, but this is a key organisation advising the United Nations. And if we bring in this one, I'm not going to read it all through, but they're very big on telling us about the good works of Lucifer. So I just wanted to end with the statement that if you think the United Nations is an organisation for the benefit of mankind, I think you need to do a little bit of research into the Lucis Trust. And finally, on this bit of World Children's Day, this is an inset video which you can find on the UN website, the UNICEF website. It's a child speaker speaking to the UN Council, and it says, I believe it's a boy or a girl. It's difficult to tell. I think it's a girl. We children understood we cannot trust that adults alone will save our future. We have to take our future into our own hands. So it's not up to adults to guide children. We children have to take the future, our future, into our own hands. But I was fascinated, Mike, by the fact that the past tense is used. That's not a mistake I've made. We children understood. And I wondered whether this little girl is repeating something she was told.
Well, as you were playing the video earlier, based on my impression of the age of the child, that was the impression I got, that this was a learned speech. I'm not certain that there was understanding necessarily of what was being said. No.
So I'll just bring up this one. This was a later part of that same video showing the face of, they happen to be labelled from Germany, but I was just fascinated by the face of these two men. And I don't pick up anything nice about this at all. So we'll leave people to think about this. The UN linked in with an organisation promoting Lucifer. And I'm just going to end on this segment on this one. So it's the Metro talking about a Transgender Day of Remembrance. Let's think about the children. And here we're dropping away from a day of remembrance, which is traditionally, of course, for military who've died in battle. It's now been shifted sideways to transgender matters, and we've got to consider transgender people. This is, of course, UN policy itself. And where is it heading? Well, it's not heading to transgender people, it's heading to transhumanism and the removal of all genders.
So much of the mainstream media, except in Britain perhaps, discussing the fact that Putin has met with Bashar al-Assad in Sochi today, where they've begun trying to get the political process for Syria restarted again. Well, it was quite a warm reception between the two. I'm very pleased to meet with you 2 years and a few weeks after Russia launched the operation, which is very successful, said Assad. It must be admitted that this operation allowed us to advance the political settlement in Syria. So Assad very grateful for the help that has been received from Russia on this. Now tomorrow they're going to be joined by the Iranian president and also the Turkish president Erdogan, and they're going to try to do some more work on the Astana ceasefire process. I'm quite sure the issue of Kurdistan is going to be part and parcel of this as well. Well, we wait and see what the outcome of that is going to be, but undoubtedly there's going to be all kinds of headlines in the West about these two men and their meetings today. Related news is that Vanessa Beeley, amongst two others, has been invited to speak to the Geneva Press Club on the 20th of November this year, much to the disgust of many of the pro-White Helmets groups who are astonished that such a conspiracy theorist could be invited to speak to a distinguished organisation like the Geneva Press Club. But I think it is a fantastic thing for her to be invited, and I'm just say congratulations to her, and I hope it goes very well. We will make people aware of the outcome of that after it happens.
Yeah, well done, Vanessa.
Right, now let's move on to Yemen. And Alistair Burt was giving a statement. He, of course, is International Development Minister. He was giving a statement to the Commons yesterday. And he said, you know, we should be very clear about the reality of the conflict in Yemen. The Saudi-led coalition launched a military intervention after a rebel insurgency took the capital by force and overthrew the legitimate government of Yemen as recognised by the UN Security Council. Ungoverned spaces in Yemen are being used by non-state actors and terrorist groups to launch attacks against regional countries, international shipping lanes and the Yemeni people. So we've got a mixture in that little statement of truth and absolute outright lies. He went on to say that, as my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has made clear, we strongly condemn the attempted missile attack against Riyadh on the 4th of November. This attack, which has been claimed by the Houthis, deliberately targeted a civilian area that was intercepted over an international airport. The United Kingdom remains committed to supporting Saudi Arabia to address its legitimate security needs. This is an incredible statement because, on one hand, he is criticising the Houthis for an attack, an alleged attack on Riyadh, a missile attack, and yet Saudi Arabia continues to dump tons of munitions on the heads of civilians. And the civilians, of course, are not getting any kind of humanitarian assistance because the Saudi Arabians have blocked all the ports and airports at this point. So he went on to say, at the same time, it's vital that commercial and humanitarian supplies of food, fuel and medicine are able to reach vulnerable Yemeni people, particularly in the north where 70% of those in need live. He said, before the current restrictions, 21 million were already in need of humanitarian assistance and 7 million were only a single step away from famine. 90% of food in Yemen is imported and 3/4 of that comes via ports. No other ports in Yemen have the capacity to make up the shortfall. He named a couple of ports. Our NGO partners in Yemen are already reporting that water and sewage systems in major cities have stopped operating because of a lack of fuel. This means that millions no longer have access to clean water and sanitation in a country already suffering from the worst cholera outbreak in modern times. This situation is completely engineered by Britain and the United States in their support of Saudi Arabia And we've got to make this point, because this think tank highlighted the truth of this statement that he has made about the Houthis basically deposing a government. This was not the case. The truth is, as to quote from this document, to reiterate, at present Mr. Hadi, who is the deposed president, is a former president of Yemen. The United Nations Security Council has no legal authority to appoint him as president of Yemen or treat him in such capacity. Although his term ended on February the 25th, 2014, Hadi remained in office until February 2015, 1 year after his term had expired, in violation of the United Nations Security Council endorsed GCC initiative. He also failed to call for general presidential elections per the agreement he signed. So if anybody was removed from their position, it was because they weren't actually legitimately in that position in the first place. And it is incredible that the likes of Alistair Burt can make statements basically legitimising this man and his government, which was illegitimate in 2014 and is certainly illegitimate today. And yet all the Saudi operations are there to try and get this illegitimate government back in Yemen.
Well, we come back to what the UN is, Mike, and I hope people are going to start to do some in-depth research themselves on that.
Just as a final point on this, I noticed that over the last week or so, week or two, the BBC has started to get interested in Yemen. This is something they have absolutely avoided doing up until now, but now they're getting very Syria-like, very Syria-style reports coming out of Yemen, reports from supposedly from doctors and so on. So I see this Yemen starting to be ramped up now that Syria has effectively been lost.
Yemen needs managing.
It's going to need managing.
Managing
yes.
by the BBC. Well, we'll stay on a theme there of health. We've done cholera. Okay, let's bring this one in on the screen. Sorry, can I step back here? Yeah, here we are. Economic and Social Research Council is boasting that it's got an extra £16.5 million to put into dementia research for 2018. Now, remember that David Cameron was getting very excited because he said there are going to be over 2 million people in Britain with dementia. I think the year was 2050, by 2050. There was no evidence to say where he got that figure from. There was no comment on where the dementia had come from. But here we now see the Economic and Social Research Council with more money to look at. And I was very interested in this, interested in your comment, Mike. The first bullet point is for their work is prevention based on an understanding of social, economic and environmental risk or protective factors and how best to affect changes in behaviour in order to lessen the risk of developing dementia.
Yeah.
So we're going to have more work on our behaviours because apparently what we do in a behavioural sense gives us dementia. I'm very intrigued at this very roundabout, text. It says social interventions to slow cognitive decline and promote social inclusion, care involvement, care support. These are all good words, but we don't see the good works happening on the ground because we know there are immense problems in the care of even just elderly people, but doubly difficult when it's elderly and very infirm with perhaps dementia. Delivery of interventions looking across care settings. So according to the Research Council, this is all about care. So I thought we'd just have a little look at who we're dealing with. And I'm fascinated that this gentleman comes up, first of all, Alan Gillespie. He's Senior Independent Director of Old Mutual. This is a major banking concern, and I'm just very intrigued as to how he became chair. Apparently, the council consists of a minimum of 10 members, plus the chair and vice chair. It's reviewed annually. Appointments are advertised nationally, and members are ultimately appointed by the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So we've now got big business and government plans for business, energy and industrial strategy, looking at how we care for people. I didn't get a warm sense from this. So let's bring in the next examples. We've got Susan Penwarden, Director of General Insurance Aviva France. Is the insurance industry, have they got a finger in the pie with dementia sufferers? Are premiums going up? Maybe, I don't know. We've also got Mr. Martin Rosenbaum, who's executive producer of the BBC. So, of course, if you want the BBC to push the right government and business line about dementia care, you've got it embedded in that organisation. And we'll bring in this gentleman because Stephen Aldridge is Director for Analysis and Data at the Department for Communities and Local Government. So a nice circular reporting system there, Mike. But since we've been hitting the BBC today, perhaps people would like to have a look at Martin Rosenbaum. And we can see that from 2004 to present, he's been executive producer of radio documentaries, magazines, programmes, politics, current affairs, social, cultural, intellectual, historical topics for BBC Radio 4, the World Service and other BBC output. So the BBC got a nice finger in the pie as big business, banks, insurers are going to be looking after those people suffering from dementia, but no apparent investigation in what's causing the dementia.
Right. Well, Office for National Statistics gave us some information today on the amount of money that the government's borrowing, which allows me to update my my outstanding debt graph here, Brian, because public sector net debt, with that excludes public sector banks, has gone up to 1.79 trillion at the end of October 2017. That's equivalent to 87.2% of GDP. And it's an increase of 147.8 billion on October 2016. So austerity seems to be doing a good job there, Brian, because we are 150 billion pounds worse off than we were last October. So that's after 6 months of the government claiming that it was borrowing less. Suddenly, in this past month, we're borrowing more again. As you can see, that allows me to update the government debt section of this. I've also updated the household debt section of this, but the overall picture hasn't really changed as a result of this, despite the government's claims that it has come through an austerity process. We are much worse off than we were, and this debt is basically unrepayable. If we take all the debt as a whole, 756% of GDP. But what was interesting about this is that they were saying that a major part of the fact that the government had to borrow more money was because of the increased repayments on interest on bonds. And why was there an increased repayment on the interest and bonds? Because the bonds, Brian, are linked to the retail prices index, and some bonds, that is, are linked to the RPI, which means that if inflation goes up, then the interest payments on the bonds goes up as well. And I just thought it was interesting that, of course, they chose the RPI as the measurement for inflation in this case, because when it comes to salaries or a host of other benefits or a host of other measurements, of course, it's consumer prices index, which is a lower inflation value, which is used. RPI is used when it suits them, particularly when there's debt involved. So that's one of the reasons why we're spending more on debt. Well, the picture is not improving.
Debt to banks who created
the money from nothing, yes.
From nothing in the first place.
Absolutely.
And I think we can also say, of course, that the graphic that you've just had on screen is totally unique to the UK column. We have never seen our national debt broken down in this form elsewhere. So if you want to challenge your local MP on this subject or challenge anybody else on it, you might care to use that UK column graphic and see what results you get.
Just make a mention of the term national debt. National debt is used generally as interchangeably with government debt, whereas what that graph is showing is not just national stroke government debt, but household debt, corporate debt, and so on. And the big elephant in the room, of course, is our obligations. It's not a true debt in the sense that we haven't borrowed the money for state pensions in order to pay them, but that is an obligation that we still have to meet, and that's why I've put it in there.
Yeah. So the debt millstone around people's heads, controlled of course by the banking system, an international and fraudulent cartel. Until we deal with that, we are not going to be dealing with most of the other problems affecting mankind. Thanks very much for joining us today. If you like what UK Column is doing, please subscribe or donate, because we can only do what we do with your financial support. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.